Welcome. Again, appreciate the overwhelming attendance here. We're going to talk testing strategies for developers, development teams, delivery teams. Quick introduction. My name is Nick Cook. I'm an App Cloud and Architecture Specialist Director with Salesforce. I've spent most of my time the past couple of years as part of our accelerator program. Delivering accelerators across the portfolio of App Cloud and Architecture, from technical debt assessments to architecture assessments, and lots of engagements in and around Sandbox Design, release development, release and deployment methodology, how to best utilize sandboxes, and of course what's incorporated that is establishing an overall quality assurance strategy as opposed to a quality maybe strategy. Prior to joining Salesforce, I spent several years as an implementation consultant in roles from process analyst to developer, solution architect, advanced developer. I hold 18 core certifications right now on Salesforce, which generally comes with a little bit of permanent head damage. I don't necessarily anticipate biting off that whole train at once, but it's a great program, and a lot of those certifications have become extra fortified in the past few years, so I definitely encourage folks to go out and take advantage of those, particularly the new Architect Academy exams. Wouldn't be a Salesforce presentation without this. We sell lots of stuff. I will talk about some other stuff. Please make all investment and purchasing decisions based only on the former. So a lay of the land quick today before I jump into the presentation. We'll talk a little bit about testing cycles and right sizing test cycles for organizations based on your level of desired risk aversion compliance requirements in your industry or organization. We'll talk about testing scope. We'll talk about Apex testing. We'll talk about elements of quality assurance that behave admittedly a little bit differently on the Salesforce platform than you may be used to on other platforms. We'll talk about code quality reviewing, collaborative tools and static tools to do some of those assessments. I'm seeing some familiar faces from my Decluttering Your Salesforce org discussion yesterday. Some similar concepts there. We'll talk about considerations of unit testing configuration items in addition to code items, and we'll talk about some test automation as well. So, good, I'm glad that shows up okay. In a typical enterprise delivery setting, right, the balance of quality assurance efforts is generally shared between a development team, delivery team, QA resources that are often part of a dedicated team, as well as incorporation with representatives from business constituents from a UAT standpoint. And I think the key takeaway when you look at kind of the broad array of concepts that are covered on this graphic is it's important to right-size your QA strategy, again, in accordance with kind of the level of risk aversion compliance requirements in an industry, right? I certainly am a fan of quality assurance. I also spend a lot of time talking with organizations about how to not overdo it, how to right-size it, and how to leverage the capabilities that make sense, right? It's sometimes we go slow to go fast on the platform, but sometimes it makes sense to go fast as well. Some organizations shift a great deal of quality assurance efforts onto the development team itself through the vehicle of unit test construction, unit test execution. How many folks would say that within your Salesforce org, your unit test structure strategy is in really, really good shape? One. We got somebody claiming that their stuff's in really good shape. So again, I've done some engagements with customers that have done a really, really good job with this, and others that have done not such a great job with this, right? It's not necessarily the fault of the customer, right? I mean, and when Apex was born and when unit tests were born and required on the platform, it was all about code coverage. I've seen some interesting things as I've gone through and done technical debt assessments on orgs where folks kind of cheat the system in that space. But really, at the end of the day, right? Organizations that do it really, really well, liberal use of system asserts, liberal use of the run as capabilities, the more robust capabilities, thinking of unit tests in Salesforce as a capability as opposed to a requirement, right? Taking it beyond the concept of code coverage. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but I've worked with organizations that take those capabilities to the point where they're confident enough that if they do a run all tests and no tests fail, that their critical path processes are intact and in good shape, right? And if you sat through the keynote yesterday and you saw some of the real-time test execution demos against the Scratch orgs from the command line interface, that's the spirit of that, right? How many folks do test execution, unit test execution when you don't have to? So for like a non-production deployment. Yeah, again, not very many, right? And organizations that have really mastered the art of unit testing and of using it to validate real end user and system process outcomes are executing those incrementally, iteratively, quickly relative to the development work that they're working on. So again, it can be a very, very, very powerful paradigm when it comes to quality assurance. And almost process monitoring, if you use it properly or to its fullest extent. The picture here also attempts to depict the iterative transfer of QA activity ownership between groups throughout the development lifecycle. So, in addition to what's seen here, a lot of dedicated agile shops, agile with a capital A, agile with a lowercase a, different organizations to different degrees. They'll often include a feature validation step that's maybe not depicted here. So, for each kind of granular request, requirement, line item in a business backlog that's part of a sprint, we'll go through a feature validation of that construction in isolation prior to merging feature branches and doing deployments. And again, that's another thing that DX really attempts to tackle more holistically, right? The whole concept of source-centric metadata management as opposed to org-centric metadata management, which is really the way the platform has kind of pushed us to behave historically, and again, that's the biggest kind of takeaway, I think, from the keynote and from DX in general, is enabling organizations to more easily make that transition to source-centric metadata management so that a lot of these concepts, including unit testing, quality assurance, becomes more accessible and becomes easier and more consistent and faster, and it's something that can be a benefit as opposed to something that you have to do that takes time in your release cycle. Can actually help you, minimize risk. Test automation, good unit test construction can enable you to go faster, accomplish more in a release cycle, while still mitigating risk. So, I like this slide. I use this slide as part of an accelerator that I do in and around Sandbox Design, how to best structure your sandbox landscape, your structure of environments across your entire development lifecycle. The reason that the the top three are starred here is I think they behave a little bit differently on the Force.com platform, right? I think for reasons that I've talked about already, unit tests in particular are a little bit of a different animal on the Salesforce platform. Again, leveraging those as a capability and as a benefit as opposed to a requirement is an important frame of mind, an important mindset, and can be something that really helps you. System integration testing is starred here, in the context of environment management in Salesforce, because it's really easy, right, to spin up a Salesforce sandbox. And the struggle that a lot of organizations have, especially with very highly integrated Force.com environments. And let's say you've got a back office system integrated and it's on-prem and it has production, QA, and dev, and that's it for environments. And you have 13 sandboxes in Salesforce, right? So the ability to kind of align developer validation test sandboxes in Salesforce to counterparts on the rest of the stack can be a challenge. It's depending on the level of real-time, near real-time integration, request response, integration points. It can be limiting because you may be limited to being able to do that type of development work, that type of feature validation, that type of testing to a sandbox or two that has a corresponding org. And some organizations work around that. It's a heavy lift, but having a proxy service, something at the middleware layer that allows you to use multiple Salesforce sandboxes against one integrated environment from another platform can be a necessary evil in a sense when you're trying to more holistically manage your sandbox environments for various types of quality assurance activities. The other thing to think about there as well, from a data integration standpoint, I've worked with a lot of organizations that love their full sandboxes and do a lot of robust work in their full sandboxes, sometimes to a fault. Configuration that's born directly in a UAT sandbox as opposed to lower in the chain. that causes synchronicity issues, metadata synchronicity issues across the entire stack, because stuff that declarative admins are doing up the chain from a deployment environment standpoint doesn't always propagate back to developers. You can have work loss. You can deploy things when you don't intend to deploy things. And again, that can be a real challenge, right? So a lot of the elements of QA strategy circles back to the concept of good metadata management, source-centric metadata management, so that you can prevent some of those merge collision issues that arise, purely technical bugs that aren't feature related at all, right? That's why it's important to, as I mentioned, that feature validation step, right? If you've developed in isolation and done a feature validation in isolation, aside from other development streams, aside from other configuration streams, and somebody says, yep, that's how I want it to work. At that point, when you get into later phases of your release lifecycle, it's more likely that, again, feature is as intended, and any remaining issues are a result of kind of the code integration, the configuration integration, and deployment processes, as opposed to actual issues with the way something was built. The other thing that's starred here is the concept of security testing. So I've worked with some organizations, and especially in high compliance industries, where in my consulting days, for example, we put together a pretty robust security structure. It was a bit of an ugly project, right? It was a straight replatform from a legacy system to Force.com. Probably wasn't the best mindset starting out, right? It was legitimately, we have this application. It's case-centric. It doesn't scale on our current platform. We're going to put the same process into Force.com because of the scalability, flexibility. In hindsight, should have probably gone through a process reimagination as part of that process as well, but we didn't. And the concept of a profile, for example, existed in their legacy system, and there were 384 of them, something of that nature. So we managed to pare that down to half that or so, leveraging permission sets, trying to make profiles as broad as possible. But as you're all aware, right, there are a lot of ways to do sharing and visibility and access control in Salesforce. And given that matrix and the depth of it, it can be very, very difficult to holistically test against that. So we on the project I'm referencing, we presented a design, a high-level design, detailed design to the quality assurance team. We said, yep, it's going to take us 500 hours to build this out. And they said, great, it's going to take us 4,000 hours to test it, right? From a profile, role, permission set, record type, field level security, all of those factors included. In their industry, they needed to go to the nth degree and say, okay, for every combination of those things, here are the fields that should be visible, here are the fields that should be editable. And it was insurmountable, right? And it kind of thrust them into the concept of test automation to cover some of those things, which we'll talk about a little down the line. But that's often the scenario that kind of bullies organizations into that capability of test automation. The rest of these things, I think, are probably fairly straightforward. I do want to make one note of data quality testing as well. That conceptually, right? I think a lot of organizations that pile too much of their QA lifecycle within that full sandbox space, the single full sandbox space for enterprise edition customers, for example. If you're doing too much in there, if you're doing feature validation, QA activities, UAT activities, data integration testing activities, all in that same space, you're prone to a lot of false results from a testing standpoint, right? If you've got processes that are manipulating data, and you've got end users that are trying to test functionality against that data that's also being manipulated, there's a fairly high likelihood that something's not going to look right. It may be right, it may be fine, but again, perception is reality when it comes to those things, and organizations burn a lot of cycles chasing down bugs that aren't really bugs. So separation of duties, good use of sandbox environments, environment management is a really important concept, and there are some great white papers on that available through the journey builder on salesforce.com/getting started, which we'll talk about a little bit later as well. So shifting gears a little bit here, back to Apex testing best practices. As was very elegantly demoed, I think, in the DX demo during the keynote, the concept of writing tests as you develop as opposed to all of once at the end, right, is an important concept. And it's again, test-centric development is something that can, I think, save organizations a lot of cycles when it comes to a more robust QA strategy. So again, admittedly idealistic, right? Sometimes you got to get code written, you got to get configuration done and get it validated and move it down the pipeline. And I'm perfectly familiar with the idea that some organizations, don't get their tests written for coverage or assertion purposes until, well into the release lifecycle. But again, that hurts organizations more than it helps them from a time standpoint, right? It's about being purposeful and being able to spot things sooner and shifting some of that ownership directly onto the development team per the graph that we showed earlier in the deck here. The concept of executing tests often, right? So iteratively during development, at key development phases, executing run all tests or tests that are pertinent to the changes that have been made from a metadata standpoint as you do, environment to environment migration or deployments out of source. Extremely important. And again, as opposed to finishing them and executing them all at once when you're ready to go from full to prod, for example, tends to uncover things substantially too late in the game. Again, capabilities from a unit test standpoint on the platform, liberal use of asserts, verifying actual system and end user outcomes through unit tests. Again, it's not I look at it as a requirement and not as a capability and not as a requirement, right? It's important to take that mindset and realizing, if you've got stuff sitting out there that's 15 versions old on the from an API standpoint, and code that was written in 2006 and 2007, and those capabilities weren't part of the platform, but it's an important initiative to refactor those things, right? And to take full advantage of the capabilities that are there. Leveraging dedicated test classes. There's no reason at this point to have data specific org specific data as part of your test strategy either, right? It's capabilities like being able to, again, upload some test data as a static resource and execute tests using that or staging all of your data virtually as you construct Apex tests as well. Super, super important. And with some of the capabilities of DX, right, you can include some of those test data files as part of your deployment package. So again, not a prerequisite to get, like with the static resources approach, you've got to get that file into the org before you can execute your tests. While with some of the capabilities of DX, you can have that as part of your deployment package and reference it as part of the process. So again, source-centric staged data as part of your deployment and test execution strategy as well. Great capability that I've seen demoed a few times now that'll really help folks out in that space. So along similar lines, when it comes to QA strategy and when it comes to the ability to proactively manage defects and code quality in particular, there's a lot of great tools out there, right? For those that attended my decluttering session yesterday, we walked through an output of the Force.com security source scanner that's publicly available up to a certain number of lines of code. It's a great place to start when it comes to security, Apex best practices, code quality, but also just the prerequisite to that is establishing technical governance standards, code standards, configuration standards, so that you have something to measure against, right? Tools like Fabricator, for example, open source, it gives you the ability to essentially lint code against a set of standards that you define, and you can publish in a wiki or whatever mechanism makes sense, so that everybody's on board with, to a granular enough degree, exactly how your organization expects code to look, right? Right down to the, spaces versus tabs, when it comes to code construction, right? I'm a two spaces guy myself when it comes to indent levels, but, running code through a process that verifies things to that level, looks for major gotchas, and organizations that do it really, really well and have a continuous delivery mechanism in place will say, okay, if your code doesn't meet standard as part of our deployment process, it's not going, and nobody wants to be the guy that broke the build, right? So it's a matter of a level of accountability and establishing some collaborative processes around that. The Force.com security source scanner is based on checkmarks. Checkmarks on its own has some more robust capabilities if you own it and can be tweaked to a pretty impressive degree when it comes to scanning code. SonarQube as well, so open source and available. There's a homebrew install for it. For example, all the prerequisites are lined up. There is a paid plugin for SonarQube that is built specifically to work on Apex test rules, and I actually think that its output is just as good or better, but it's a little bit harder collaboratively than some of the other tools, but can really point you in a great direction. Again, highly encourage folks to kind of check out some of this stuff and run some code quality scans as part of your regular deployment process. So the other piece, right? We've talked a lot about Apex unit testing and about testing and code-centric things. Think about configuration as well, right? So we had this discussion yesterday as part of my session around process builder and process builder versus Apex triggers, things like that. And I've worked with some organizations now that have really grabbed process builder by the horns and done some pretty substantial work in reducing code footprints and doing consolidation of legacy workflows and things like that. But one organization in particular that really started that initiative early in the capability. So yeah, okay, we've gone through and we've consolidated workflow and we've been able to factor out some of the code that we use that has workflow capability because they no longer had issues with workflow limits on objects and things like that. But what they soon realized is the unit tests that they were executing against code that verified their system processes. They were doing a good job doing that and leveraging unit tests that way. When they factored out the code from the trigger base and put it into process builder, they factored out the unit tests as well. So as these kind of critical decision points, business automation was moved into a declarative function, they no longer had that safeguard of the unit test, and there's no reason not to, really. If you've got critical path processes that are dependent on process builder or on workflow, there's no reason you can't write a unit test against those, right? It's, again, thinking about it outside of the context of code coverage. It's just as important to assert outcomes of declarative process automation that's critical to your organization as it is to do the same in code, right? It's, with great power comes great responsibility almost, right? It's, you can do stuff in process builder, but that doesn't mean you don't need to execute unit tests against it. I think organizations that have been successful in doing some of that conversion, treat that capability as, code-centric from a process standpoint, right? It's there are things that you can do of a greater level of criticality with some of that capability, so an important consideration there. So a few words then about test automation as well. So again, I mentioned this scenario with the massive matrix of security elements, roles, profiles, page layouts, record types, and how difficult that can be from a test standpoint. You'll see some familiar names here. I know a lot of these organizations are here. I encourage you to go have a discussion with AutoRabbit, go have a discussion with Capado about not only their deployment management capabilities, metadata management capabilities, but about their test automation capabilities as well, and how you can roll all of that together, tie it back full circle to some of your user stories and manage it from a requirements traceability matrix standpoint. But the point that I really want to drive home about test automation is it's the QA lifecycle for organizations, particularly high compliance industry organizations. Oftentimes, what prevents better release velocity, better release throughput is a bottleneck in the QA lifecycle, right? It's if you've got a set of elements that you've designed and constructed as part of, let's say, like a 2-week sprint, but it takes you 5-6 weeks to get through regression testing, QA, UAT, all of that. It doesn't really help that you can develop faster, right? The bottleneck still persists further down the development lifecycle. So what a lot of organizations do is they start with, again, critical path processes. They do test automation against those, and it allows them to go faster, right? They just kind of say, okay, our level of compliance dictates that for non-critical path processes, we can deal with incremental break-fix releases and things like that, depending on your release cadence capabilities. But making sure that you've got essentially process monitoring in place to be able to ensure that you haven't broken something that prevents somebody from doing their job, as part of your test automation process. Where that often grows is from just kind of having test automation around critical path processes. It grows into, the ability to execute essentially a regression suite from an automated test, so that from a QA lifecycle standpoint, from a release management standpoint, you're really only doing manual testing, feature validation testing against net new functionality, as opposed to the whole suite of capabilities in your particular implementation. So again, concept is early detection, defect reduction, and the ability to just minimize execution time when it comes to quality assurance efforts. Ultimately, organizations use it as a catapult to shorten that release cadence. Let's say you're releasing quarterly, you can go to monthly. You're releasing monthly, you can try to go every 2 weeks, every week, things like that. So again, I mentioned at the top the salesforce.com/getting started. Tons and tons of good resources in and around this concept. Environment management, release management, technical governance, fantastic white papers available as part of the Success Journey Hub to go and tackle that. There are concepts about QA strategy, test automation strategy, release management, in Trailhead as well, right? It's not just configuration development stuff, there's conceptual stuff as well, and I encourage folks to look at that. Demonstrations of some of the tools that I've discussed exist from Dreamforce sessions that you can access as well. Some great circles of success as part of our Salesforce success community in and around these topics, and some very targeted accelerators for those of you that are Premier Plus signature customers that can really help you kind of define your environment landscape, define your release management process, and bring those things together. Marry the technical capabilities of environment management with the processes that you want to implement from a release management perspective. So I highly encourage folks to check those things out as well. Got a few minutes left. I talked a little bit too much, but happy to take questions while we've got a few minutes. Yeah. Yeah. So the question is regarding the slide that had the strike through on the CL data equals true around unit tests. The question is there a legitimate use case to have a unit test, use org-based data as part of your test execution process? And it may be a little idealistic, but at this point I think there isn't. Right, there were some limitations early on around specific objects being accessible from like a test data virtualization standpoint, but given the ability to use flat files and the accessibility of more of those objects in code, I think we're beyond that point now. It's something that I definitely look for as part of code scans and say, okay, where are folks short-circuiting the unit test process by, making it org specific? So, I think it's at a point where it can be completely done away with. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah. Great question, and I probably should have had a slide about that. The question is, what do I recommend for testing Lightning? So there's a great Chrome plugin that allows you to kind of see end-to-end an execution stack in Lightning, so to cover more of the client side. Safe Harbor, there's a lot of plans in that space from a developer experience standpoint as well. Not part of the initial, open pilot, but it's definitely a shortcoming, right? I've preached a lot about unit tests here, but realizing that they kind of go through the model layer, the controller layer. They don't really go through the view layer that much. It doesn't go all the way through to the UI, and that's where some of the other test automation capabilities, your Provars, Selenium, things like that, can boost that a little bit. But it's a fair point, right? The concept of Lightning and how much more code resides and executes on the client kind of changes the face of the way we unit test at this point, right? It doesn't have a coverage requirement, but it should probably have a unit test anyway, right? So I'm glad you brought that up because it's an important thing to think about. Yeah. I am. I don't see why not, right? I mean, it's mostly community sourced, right? So, say again. Oh, really? Interesting. Yeah. No, the question's about Cinnamon. So, a Salesforce-centric pack that plays nicely with Selenium and allows you to test across browser versions and types and all that. Again, extending the test capability into the UI tier a little bit more, right? And so I'll follow up on that. That's a great question. Others? I got 8 seconds to go. Yeah. Yeah. Possibly. I'll take that offline. I got to probably return my mic, but I'll come right down and we can talk about that. Thanks, folks. Appreciate the time and attention.